So America is drawing a line in the ocean. It's their line of defense against China, military defense. But what about financial defense? That could be trickier. China is the only serious threat to America's military power. But their economic power is a different story altogether. Everyone wants a piece of it. And their biggest target? The US dollar. By the way, India is on the same mission, to reduce its dependence on the US dollar. Instead, India wants to use the rupee. And on Saturday, that mission got a huge boost. Prime Minister Modi was in the UAE for an official visit. After the talks, both sides made an announcement. They decided to establish a system to trade in local currencies, basically a Rupee-Dirham trade. How would that work? Well, normally bilateral trade is done in US dollars. It's widely accepted all over the world. It's backed by the US economy, and it's easy to exchange the dollar. So buying and selling with the US dollar makes sense. But India and the UAE are planning to remove the dollar from this equation. So Indian importers will be able to buy using rupees, and Emirati importers will be able to buy in dirhams. How does it help us? For starters, you won't use up a lot of your reserves. Those dollars can be safe in your bank. So more forex stability. And secondly, things will be less volatile. Your import bill will no longer depend on the US dollar, which is the situation right now. If the dollar rises, so will your import expenditure. Your bill goes up. You end up paying more for the same thing. The rupee-dirham trade can reduce this volatility. The dollar's tantrums won't affect you, at least not as much. And India is pushing this strategy with multiple partners. Banks from 18 countries have opened special accounts in India. These include Germany, the UK, Israel, Malaysia, and Russia. So the system is very much in place. The question is how many countries are using it? Bangladesh and Sri Lanka have expressed interest. So has Indonesia now. Their finance minister is in India for G20 talks. Both countries are looking at creating a rupiah trade. Rupiah is the currency of Indonesia. Indian officials say African and Gulf nations are also keen on the rupee. The key is to translate this interest into deals, to sign more local currency agreements with various countries. But that's easier said than done. Look at the rupee-ruble trade, for instance. India and Russia wanted to trade in their own currencies, the rupee and the ruble. Politically, it made sense. But financially, it did not. We buy a lot from Russia, but the Russians don't buy as much from us. So Moscow would have ended up with a huge pile of unusable rupees, which is why the talks are stalled. But India is not giving up. This deal with the UAE could be the boost that the rupee needs. And there are three reasons for that. One, there's a lot of money at stake. India-UAE trade is almost $85 billion. It is growing at 20% annually. So 100 billion is not really far off. Now, even if some of this trade is done in rupees, it will be a lot of money. Reason number two, the fuel bill. UAE is India's fourth biggest source of oil. They sell around 200,000 barrels per day. Imagine if we could buy all of that oil in rupees. Think about how much we could save in dollar reserves. And reason number three, the remittance factor. Around 3 million Indians live in the UAE. They have to send money back home. The rupee-dirham trade could help them by reducing the transaction cost, by reducing the settlement time, meaning you can send money faster and at better rates. And I know all of this sounds wonderful, but like with the ruble, there are challenges. You see, India has a huge trade deficit with the UAE, around $15 billion, which means we buy a lot more than we sell them. Most of it is oil. So will the UAE agree to using the rupee? Or will they also backtrack like Russia? And that is a big concern. There's some good news on that front, though. I mentioned that India has a trade deficit with the UAE. That was not always the case. Between 2014 and 2017, India, in fact, had a trade surplus with them. We sold more than we bought. So the goal is to reach that level again. Then the UAE will be more than happy, in fact, to take the rupee. And things are looking good on that front. They're on the right trajectory. India and the UAE signed a free trade agreement last year. Experts say Indian exports are set to double by 2027. If that happens, the rupee-dirham trade could also flourish. But what about beyond the UAE? This is where things get a bit tricky. Ideally, India would want to use rupees when there is a deficit, because they can save dollar reserves. But those countries are not always willing. Case in point, Russia. Then you have countries with a trade surplus like Bangladesh or Nepal or Sri Lanka. Those countries are more than willing to use local currencies, but in these cases, India may not agree. Take Bangladesh, for example. Their exports to India are around $2 billion, but their imports are around $14 billion. So Bangladesh's deficit with India is $12 billion. Now, assume this trade was done in rupees and takas, the Bangladeshi currency, taka. Will India be willing to accept $14 billion worth of Bangladeshi takas? We only need $2 billion for trade. What will we do with the rest? That's the problem with trading in local currency. You need to strike deals with dozens of countries, some with deficits, some with a surplus. Only then can you internationalize the rupee. New Delhi has certainly scored a big win by getting the UAE on board, but the key is to build on this momentum. Now let's talk about Jammu and Kashmir. In a few weeks from now, it will hit a major landmark. 4 years since the scrapping of Article 370, a much contested move. It changed the identity of Jammu and Kashmir from a state to a union territory. It was a political, social and security challenge. There was intense scrutiny, both at home and outside, but 4 years on, the move seems to be paying off. Kashmir is getting foreign investment. It played host to a G20 meeting. It has seen a record number of tourists, and its local industries are being revived. Tonight, we bring you one such story of revival, the saffron trade. It's blooming again. This exotic spice of Kashmir now has a GI tag, and prices have shot up by more than 60%. Here's a report.
This is Kashmiri saffron. Many call it the red gold, mainly because it's priced just like real gold. 1 kilogram of the spice can cost up to $4,000. The saffron is part of every royal feast. It has caught the imagination of chefs, aficionados of luxury, even makers of traditional medicine for centuries. Kashmiri saffron was sought after around the world, and its producers enjoyed worldwide recognition. But the king of spices was on the verge of extinction. This is the home of Kashmiri saffron, Pampore, a tiny town right outside the capital city of Srinagar. Many buyers of saffron called Pampore the capital of saffron. More than 20,000 families farm it. They cultivate the saffron completely by hand. They plant the saffron flower between July and September. Roughly 8 weeks later, they pluck the flowers and separate each saffron strand by hand. It takes as many as 150,000 flowers to produce 1 kilo of saffron. The process is labor-intensive. Plus, the saffron cannot grow anywhere. The saffron flower is delicate. It's usually planted at an altitude of over 1,600 meters. That's why the Kashmiri saffron is so expensive. In recent decades, the process became a liability. Since the late 1990s, there was a rapid decline in production. Locals claimed the land for cultivation was shrinking, and climate change rapidly eroded the soil. Frequent droughts and falling water levels destroyed its fertility. By 2018, production dropped by over 60%. Competition from Iran worsened the situation. It's believed the Iranians brought saffron to Kashmir. In the modern day, they still dominate the global trade. 90% of the world's saffron is made in Iran. Iran's domination became a challenge for Kashmiri producers. They were being undercut in the market by cheaper saffron from Iran. It was being passed off as Kashmiri saffron. The real product was losing its ground fast, and Kashmiri farmers were losing hope. The government attempted a rescue. In 2010, a national saffron mission was launched. $57 million were poured to teach saffron farmers new cultivation methods, but the initiative failed. The turnaround came in 2020. The fix was a new piece of technology, a Geographical Indication or G.I Tag. This is a first for the saffron industry. The G.I Tag became the new identity of the Kashmiri saffron. For buyers, the tag was a hallmark of quality. It's given only after a batch passes quality checks. The G.I Tag has restored trust. It helped in fighting off the competition and verifying the product's authenticity. The buyers are now making a beeline. Earlier this month, the Kashmiri saffron became 5 times more expensive than silver. About 10 grams of spice was trading at around $40. Despite the steep prices, buyers from lucrative markets like the US, Europe, and Canada are picking up Kashmir saffron again. In a short span of time, the humble GI tag has secured 3 wins. It has helped in building trust, re-established the market for the Kashmir saffron, and put the valley back on the world map.
If you Google China today, 9 out of 10 headlines will talk about its economy. Growth below expectations, sinking property prices, and impending slowdown. That's all that the world is talking about. But none of this has stopped China from targeting Taiwan. The provocations continue. Last week, China sent fighter jets, bombers, and warships towards Taiwan. Over the course of 3 days, more than 70 Chinese planes crossed the median line. This is the de facto border between Taiwan and China, the median line. As the threat grows, the world is talking about possible scenarios, and all of these scenarios feature the US. What will America do to contain China? Will it go to war with China over Taiwan? What is America's military strategy vis-a-vis Taiwan? These questions are being asked. Tonight we have some answers. Tonight we want to tell you about what's being called America's wall of defense. This is in the waters around Taiwan. The US is arming allies and building military presence. To understand this wall of defense, let's first understand the lay of the land. This is the region we're talking about, East Asia, already heavily militarized with a sizable presence of US forces. Starting with South Korea. South Korea has about 73 US bases and more than 26,000 American soldiers. Then we have Japan, and double the numbers. Japan has 120 American bases with more than 50,000 US troops. And these are the larger deployments. But US military presence is not limited to these countries. There are bases in the Philippines, Cambodia, Singapore, Brunei, and Guam, which again is a large hub. Guam has about 8,000 US troops. If you connect these dots, you'll see that the Americans have more than a foothold in the region. But that may not be enough to contain China. At least that is Washington's assessment. It remains worried about China's moves. Look at what their latest defense strategy says. It calls China the quote-unquote most comprehensive and serious challenge to the US. I have a copy of that report. Let me quote from what it says. The PRC is the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. This is the American assessment. The US recognizes the threat posed by China. The question is, what will they do about it? From what we understand, the US military strategy has 2 parts. Part 1 is arming allies, and part 2 is getting access to more bases. And this plan is already being executed. Take the case of Japan. There is complete shift in its defense posture, a complete shift there. Japan is dumping its pacifist credentials. It is preparing for war with American weapons. Let me show you how. Japan is building a chain of militarized islands. It is loading them with military hardware and facilities. Take a look at this one. It's an island called Ishigaki. Recently, Japan built a garrison here. In March 2023, it also made an announcement. Japan was sending more than 500 members of the Ground Self-Defense Force. Now, that's their version of an army. Japan technically does not have an army. Their constitution does not allow it. They want to change it. But as of today, what they have is something called a self-defense force. It can only be used for defense. It cannot participate in an attack or an offensive operation. But as Japan shifts away from pacificism, its forces are beginning to look like a real army. The troops in Ishigaki, for instance, are being armed. They're getting 150 military vehicles and land-to-ship and land-to-air missile units. Also America's Patriot missile system. Then we have another island called Yonaguni. It has about 160 Japanese troops. In April this year, they too got a Patriot missile system. Same with the island of Miyako. It has, in fact, the same missile defense system, plus an entire military base with 700 to 800 troops. And anti-ship surface-to-air missile batteries. Also radar and intelligence gathering facilities. Another island called Amami Oshima has similar deployments. Earlier this year, Japan started work on yet another island called Mageshima. Tokyo is building a military base here as well, and I have some pictures. This is what the island of Mageshima looks like. Reports say a military base is being built here. It will be used by the US military for aircraft training. A pre-existing base will be relocated here. There will be new runways, a control tower, and an explosives depot. It will be a full-fledged military facility for the US military. Now look how close it is to Taiwan and the Chinese borders. The goal is quite clear: to be within striking distance of China. In fact, the US is getting access to more bases in the region. Recently, it struck a deal with the Philippines. It got access to 4 more bases, 3 on the island of Luzon, which is close to Taiwan, and 1 in Palawan. This is in the South China Sea. Now, in case you're wondering what America will do with so many bases, let me show you. This is what they're building: America's wall of defense against China. This is what it looks like. 2 chains of interconnected islands, starting from Japan and South Korea in the north to Malaysia, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea in the south. These 2 island chains are supposed to deter China, and this is not a new idea, by the way. It was first proposed in the year 1951 by John Foster Dulles. He later became the US Secretary of State. Some 70 years back, Dulles proposed the island chain strategy. Back then, the objective was to contain both the Soviet Union and China. He wanted a string of naval bases in the Pacific to restrict access to the sea, both for Moscow and Beijing. And now, all these decades later, that plan is being revived. It may or may not work, but China will see this as encirclement, an attempt at containment, which is what it is. So expect Beijing to react sharply. In fact, it's a bit of a catch-22 situation for the world. These attempts to prevent a war might end up provoking one. The thing about saffron, it's really expensive, among the costliest spices out there. But then again, not like saffron is the foundation of human rights and freedoms. That would be democracy. But guess what? Like saffron, democracy too is becoming expensive, specifically American democracy. Let me explain. Joe Biden's campaign has released its financial data. Get ready to be shocked. The campaign raised $72 million in the second quarter of this year, $72 million in 3 months. Put together, the campaign has around $77 million in cash. Biden's rivals are nowhere near. Donald Trump's campaign has raised around $35 million in the same period. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis raised $20 million. You may think that's a lot of money, but by next year, these numbers will be even higher. Let's look at 2020, the last election year, the presidential election. Biden's campaign raised $1 billion. It was a first in US election history, $1 billion of campaign money. Trump's campaign raised around $774 million. Where did all of this money come from? Until 2010, campaign money came from direct donations. But then came a US Supreme Court judgment. The court said corporations must also be allowed to donate. If not, it would restrict freedom of speech. You can imagine what happened next. Corporate America flooded all election campaigns. In 2020, total spending for the presidential race was $5.7 billion. For Congress, it was $8.7 billion. Put together, the total expense was $14.4 billion. Let me put that number in perspective. The GDP of 70 countries, 70 countries, is less than $14 billion. In other words, the US spends the GDP of 70 countries to elect lawmakers. Afterwards, they call them public servants. The humble people devoted to serving the public. There are 2 problems with that trend. One, the ridiculous numbers. It doesn't matter if you're the richest country in the world, $14 billion is too much money. Democracy should not cost that much. And 2, the influence that comes with this kind of money. In 2016, the NRA donated around $30 million to Donald Trump. What is the NRA? The National Rifle Association. It's a major pro-gun lobby in the US. They donated a lot of money to Donald Trump, and guess what Trump did after coming to office? He made it easier to buy guns. Imagine this happening across state legislatures and Congress. Each lawmaker funded by some sort of interest, maybe anti-abortion or pro-guns or anti-climate action, tells you why America is facing so many political divides. The democracy is built on money. If big corporations want to, they can make anyone the US president. If not Biden or Trump, then someone else. The question is, where is this money going? Now, some expenses are understandable. For example, travel. The US is the fourth largest country by area, so covering each state and city will be expensive. It will cost money. But what about the advertisements? A huge chunk of the expense is for running television and social media ads. Again, I have some numbers for you. In the 2022 midterm elections, around $6.4 billion was spent on ads. $6.4 billion. It's become a race of sorts. Who can take out more advertisements and smear campaigns? The US media does not bother to question this. And why would they? After all, they are the ones getting all this ad money. It's the perfect vicious circle. The fact is, big corporates have turned American democracy into a spectacle. Just think about it. Where else do you have 2-year-long campaigns and made-for-TV debates, or unrestricted corporate donations, or television networks calling elections and deciding the winner? It's not about counting the votes, it's about counting the dollars. And for the record, other countries have done much better. In the last UK general election, the Conservatives spent $20 million. That's it, $20 million for the party's greatest victory since 1987. Canada, too, has done better. Their entire general election cost around $650 million. It's a lot, but nothing compared to $14 billion. And what about India? The 2019 general election cost around $8 billion. This includes campaign spending and organizational costs. Now, some context here. The US is around 170 million voters. India has around 940 million. At first glance, the costs seem justified, but we should keep an eye on the trajectory. Election expenses in India have increased 6-fold in the last 2 decades. We can't let this figure run away. In the US, that's exactly what has happened. Democracy and elections became commoditized in America, a spectacle for everyone to make a buck. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. A group of scuba divers spotted an extremely rare creature called the oarfish off the coast of Taiwan. The fish was found with mysterious holes on its body. Last week, India made history by launching Chandrayaan-3. Some people got a chance to witness this moment from a plane. Meanwhile, the FIFA Women's World Cup 2023 will begin soon. An acrobatic skydiver unfurled its banner over New Zealand's Auckland and landed in Eden Park. And finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day, in 1936, the Spanish Civil War began. Troops initiated the uprising under the leadership of General Francisco Franco. The Soviet Union supported Republicans who stood by the Spanish government. Nazi Germany supported the nationalists who favored the military rather. Ultimately, the nationalists won. We're leaving you with that. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Fighting, killing go on in the desperate battle for power. The communist salute is used by everybody in bus and the government, though not communist itself. After a hasty training of 5 days, recruits are rushed to the... No one can move either way without a pass. The Paramount cameraman shows his. He is allowed through.
Lift off normal, pivot.
Thank you.